yet. And I look at all the UFO literature and the celestial theosophical type of literature as ways that people have tried to explain it. And there's some parts of it, like with the ancient astronaut, that ring very true and powerfully resonate. But I'm not an archaeologist. I can't read Sumerian, and I certainly can't understand cuneiform tablets. So I have to take the word of Zachariah Sitchin and other people who do. So it is with all external knowledge. But throughout my entire life, I felt the guiding presence of what seemed to be the ancient gods of old, and this is how they identify themselves, this is how they communicate, this is how they've communicated to me through other people sometimes. So that's my belief, and I believe that all the exploration that I'm doing is part of the process of returning to our divine source. And I believe that everybody and everything has a divine source.
Okay. Now, I take it then you believe there's such thing as gods.
Yes, I believe that all the gods of old, including the God of the Old Testament and the New Testament, and maybe they're the same thing, are real on some level. And I believe that if they weren't real before we experience them, I believe that if enough people believe in something strong enough, it can become real to them, if to nobody else. I believe that our perceptions, and this is something, by the way, that anybody who explores occultism runs into, because a lot of intelligences can appear in any way that they choose. Oh, and I do a workshop on that where I look at reports of these shadowy beings.
You mean like shadow people and stuff like that?
Like the shadow people, and that's a very big part of the Greek tradition also, and they have an explanation for it. But if you look at explanations of cryptozoologists and ufologists and monster hunters and demonologists and religious people, they also have encountered these beings, but they've explained them differently. So what might be a satyr to somebody who's into the old Olympian mythos, that translates into an incubus or a succubus in the medieval Christian influence than the earlier Hebraic, explanations. People have reported these things in the proximity of UFOs. People have encountered these beings when they do the type of dream work that you do and that I do. So the MO and the description is identical, and the type of results that you get are identical, but what differs is the explanation that each of these categories of people have created to make sense of it in light of their particular reality.
Well, what's your definition of a shadow person?
The shadow people are something that were perceived in my family for generations. And I started experiencing them when I was very, very young. In fact, in one of Tim Beckley's books, I shared some of these stories. And my grandmother had experienced them also, my paternal grandmother. Other Greeks knew about them, but again, just they're types of spirits. They're tied to the ancient elemental type of creatures like the fauns and the centaurs. And it was they're described as kalikanzari or satyrs. And kalikanzari are kind of like the shadows of the creatures that were, and they're fading. And the stories told about them, and I've heard lots of stories from people who experienced it, are very reminiscent of like troll stories, and stories of like Krampus and things like that. So all these stories are related in some way, even though the explanations are different. So if I was approaching it through my Olympian worldview, the lore that is accumulated about satyrs who can influence dreams describe what these things are and their MO very, very well. And Hillman, I believe, wrote a transpersonal psychology book where he looked at that particular way of looking at things. But as to what they ultimately are, I don't know, because I know what they look like, what it is like to experience them. And I have explanations from my native culture, but other native culture have others' explanations. And theirs make sense, too, within the context of their cultural construct. So ultimately and eventually, I don't know what they actually are, but I do know that they exist, and I do know that people experience them. When I used to teach this particular topic, regardless of how big or small the audience was, there was always at least somebody in the audience that experienced the shadow people and had stories to tell. To support... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was saying, I only saw one shadow person in my whole life. I was about 10 years old. I grew up in Seattle. My dad's brother lived in Oakland, California, along with his mother. And she had an old apartment in Oakland. And I was supposed to spend the summer with her, but I ended up, after one night or two nights, going over to my uncle's house. Because her apartment was really old. And we're talking about in the early 60s here. So I would say maybe 1870s. It was that vintage of a building. I remember the bedroom was huge. Of course, I was a little kid, so it could have been small. But she had a walk-in closet with a little dim light. And here, she put me a bed for the night. And, I was wide awake, just kind of looking around in the room. And then I was looking at this walk-in closet because I never saw a walk-in closet where the bed drops out of the closet, and it was rather interesting. And then I saw this shadow come out. And it went really slow around the whole room. And then it went back into the closet. And I pulled the blanket over my head. I was so terrified. I called my parents up the next day and said, I can't stay here. And that was my only experience of a shadow person or whatever it was. It was really scary. And, my definition at the time, my dad said maybe it was somebody that lived in that apartment that passed on, and it's a ghost, and it, like a recording. It was, just walking in the bedroom, but I don't know. I still don't know to this day what it was.
I still don't know either. Were there any? Usually, when those things are encountered by adults, there is in their dream state sexual type of dreams after a while. And usually they're found in places where there's like a bar nearby, and usually there's like mountains and forests, although sometimes it's near a desolate land as well. But a lot of the mythology about like the creatures that some Greeks believe these things are the deteriorated form of, they are in these type of environments in the stories. And the last experience I had with one of these creatures was in a small walk-in closet, like you described. So there's a synchronicity there. It's hard with all of these explorations. Even Area 51, there are so many explanations that they can't all be right. And that's the same with a lot of this phenomena. It's real. People experience it and they're affected by it, but they're very elusive and slippery in some way, too. And you can accept an explanation, and it will make sense to you within the context of the reality of that explanation, but the explanation is not always true. So I believe there's something lacking in all our explorations. I believe it's all like that story with the elephant, where blind people were touching the trunk or the leg or the nails or the tail, and they were describing, and they were describing the same thing, but their perspective was kind of limited, and again, they couldn't see what it was, so their explanations were sometimes off the mark. So I don't really believe anything too powerfully, because I know that something can change my beliefs, and I try to get the truth of things, and I know that that'll take time, and sometimes it may never happen. So my favorite place to be is the Olympian spirituality and with the cosmic UFOs and things like that. So that's where I'm having the most enjoyment and fulfillment. So for that reason alone, it's worth being there.
Oh yeah, you put it so well. Because again, I think you have to open up your inner self before you can even begin to start understanding, anything.
Yes.
I will say this, because we're almost out of time here. Dream state. I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but I actually feel what's going on in the dream. So if I brush it, if I open the door, I actually feel like putting my hand on the doorknob. I feel the door open. I feel the door close. If I'm in a car, I feel like I'm actually driving the car. If I'm, being chased, or if I'm trying to, whatever I'm in my dream, and most of my dream, I have to say, it goes around the 14th century. To around the 16th century for some reason. My mind kind of defaults to that area. And it's so realistic. And then, I wake up in the morning and, especially on the weekends, I'll sit there and tell my wife all this long dream. And then I asked her, I said, hey, Linda, what was your dream last night? I don't know. And I think so many people close that off. And they think it's not normal to dream. And dreaming expands your brain, just like meditation does.
Yes, very true. And like you, I find myself in a marvelous universe, and a lot of what I do is my attempt to share this marvelous universe. And especially after being young and not being able to share it, and now that I'm older and I've gotten more eccentric as I've gotten older and less likely not to share things directly, it's a wonderful thing, and it's always a pleasure to meet other people who are open to these things and to share it, to swap stories with them, and it's very fulfilling and enriching. And thank you so very much for having me on again. This has been a very pleasant experience, and I'm looking forward to a part 2. So this week sometime we will schedule a show together.
Okay, now your website. How can people find you, Hercules?
My website, unfortunately, Earthlink changed the programming, and I haven't had the opportunity to train myself how to alter things. So the website is old, but it's HerculesInvictus.net. That's Hercules, INVICTUS.net. And the best way to actually reach me is on Facebook. I'm fairly active on Facebook, and there it's Hercules Invictus. And that is actually the best way to reach me. And my contact information is on the old site, so there's my email address there and my telephone number, so I'm pretty accessible.
Now, your websites, how can they find those? I mean, not websites, your podcast.
Oh, the podcast, if they go to Blog Talk Radio, and that's one big word, and then do a / and CERN, SURN. That's the Spiritual Unity Radio Network, and that's the station I'm currently on. And by next year, I'll have my own station, because right now I have the 3 podcasts. I'm working on a 4th. I'm working on a YouTube channel. So very soon I'll have run out of space on somebody else's network, so I'm forming my own.
That does happen. I mean, that's the same with me. I have my own network because I use a lot of bandwidth. I have my own servers. I feed out to the radio stations. I go on to all the apps. I tell you what, it's complicated. I mean, how technology over the last 15 years has advanced. Hey, Hercules, I want to thank you for coming on the show. Get a hold of me, and I would love to come on your show, and we can talk about dreams and maybe parallel universes, because I sometimes travel to those. But anyway.
That is awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay, sir. You have a great one.
You too.
Okay, my friend. Night.
Good night.
So anyway, we're going to continue here for the next half an hour. James is going to be calling back in. We're going to get back into, UFOs and stories, maybe ghosts, ghost hunting, Bigfoot, who knows, for the next half an hour. You're listening to Night Dreams Talk Radio After Dark. This is Gary. If you want to be a guest on my show, say you ran into a Bigfoot,